Testing, testing. Guess I'll sit down. Okay, without further ado, let's start. It all started way back, such a long, long time back, way back in the days when the grass was still green and the pond was still wet and the clouds were still clean and the song of the Swanee Swans rang out in space. One morning I came to this glorious place and I first saw the trees, the truffula trees, but then humans came with their harmless machines and relentless greed. This is UNT, where we mean green all year long, not just on Earth Day, presenting a program about what has happened and is happening to our changing planet. Thus, we affirm today's resolution that when in conflict, environmental protection should be valued as more significant than economic growth. We have made two observations of the resolution, the first of which is that it asks us to debate about the mutually exclusive values between protecting the environment and economic growth, which means that you have to evaluate the comparative advantages of prioritizing one over the other and their costs and benefits. Secondly, is that when in conflict specifically describes a zero-sum solution, which means that TCU, or this group of once-lers, has to defend that economic growth that is inherently in conflict or at odds with environmental protection is good, not anything in conjunction. In order to better scope out the resolution, we have defined environmental protection as regulations on the environment for the sake of preservation or restoration, which would include things such as the Paris Climate Accord, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and so forth. While economic growth, on the other hand, is simply an increase in production of goods and services that is relative to the people and typically measured in GDP. In this case, it requires things such as mass resource extraction as well as the large-scale land usage and development that includes things like deforestation. Contention 1 is going to be factory farming. According to the United Nations, the number of industrial livestock that is sent to the slaughter each year is equivalent to 8 times the human population on Earth. We've all watched those industry farming videos that show these animals confined to small spaces and also being thrown to trash bins when they're deemed as worthless by the industry. Specifically, if we look to these big industry tycoons like McDonald's, Walmart, and specifically Tyson, they slaughter up to 35 million chickens and up to 125,000 cattle every week, while Tyson specifically excretes 55 million tons of manure a week, a year, while the total is easily more than 500 million. Specifically, this has caused drastic effects across water pollution since, according to the EPA, U.S. agriculture actually contributes nearly 75% of all water quality related problems in the nation's rivers and streams, simply because the toxins from manure and fertilizer that is put into these waterways exacerbates large harmful algae blooms that create oxygen deprived stretches. Tyson has been known to create the largest dead zone within the Gulf of Mexico. There is also another inherent problem with air pollution when it comes to factory farms, insofar as they excrete 37% of methane emissions that is uniquely has a higher warming potential that is up to 20 to 25 times higher than CO2. And uniquely, regulations are necessary in order to mitigate against these harmful impacts. Specifically, we have to force these factory farms into not only things such as higher transparency, stricter scrutiny, and making sure that bans are in place on harmful farming practices, as well as the fact that we need to protect these deforested areas and help them restore. Contention 2 is going to be energy production. The well-documented link between rising economic growth and rising greenhouse gas emissions not only indicates but means that emissions are only set to increase at a faster rate as countries consume and become more dependent on fossil fuels, especially if environmental protection measures are not taken. According to the World Resources Institute, of the total global CO2 emissions, coal contributes to 43% of it, while oil contributes to 33%. This essentially leads to a runaway greenhouse warming effect, as we obviously know, that also heats up the planet. However, the methods of mining, things such as coal as well as oil, are even more harmful to the environment as well. Specifically, in the U.S. alone, there are over 2 million oil and gas wells, while 95% of them are fractured. NOAA conducted a study within Weld County, Colorado, that estimated that 4% of the methane produced in these wells is actually released into the atmosphere. This is equivalent to the CO2 emission of 1 to 3 million cars. And we put this in comparison to the large amounts of wells in the United States. This is obviously a large problem. And we can even take into account accidents like oil spills, such as ExxonMobil as well as Exxon Valdez, which also need higher regulation in order to prevent these accidents from happening. Empirical evidence just shows us that switching to unresearched commercial alternatives like nuclear comes with their own problems. Accidents like Chernobyl and the fact that nuclear waste has to go somewhere has contributed to a large problem in the United States. And when humans avoid confrontation with environmental problems in sake of capitalist projects, this just leads to more things like ice ages, that's a Snowpiercer reference, and also the mass dumping of radioactive waste onto indigenous lands.
Just checking if this is working. No. Okay. Push that. Hello, hello, testing. Nope.
Maybe just be
Hold it down.
Oh, stand up.
hold it down. No, hold the button down.
Yeah. Yeah, we can just stand up and project too.
I think they're wireless, so I mean you could just use
Yeah,
this.
yours is green. Yours is red. That's the difference.
Oh, now. Here we go, partnership.
Looks like green technology wins. In considering the conflict between environment and economy that every society faces, Costa Rica is an example worth our consideration. In the 1970s, Costa Rica recognized that it was plagued by deforestation as a result of its heavy reliance on agriculture over the preceding century. Understanding that the survival of Costa Rican ecosystems was vital to the world environment, the Costa Rican government opted to lay the groundwork for a national economy founded on ecotourism with regulations built for environmental sustainability. Today, they are widely considered both one of the greenest nations in the world and the strongest economy in Central America. Often in our conflicts between A and B, ideological leaders force us to either pick only A or only B. Costa Rica shows us how there's always an option C, compromise. Sarah, Veronica, and I are not here to tell you that the economy is more significant than the environment, but that the two go hand in hand and hold equal significance in smart policy making. It is with this understanding that we oppose the resolution when in conflict, environmental protection should be valued as more significant than economic growth. We offer the following argumentation. First, smart policy balances interests and celebrates achievements on economy and environment equally. The United States Environmental Protection Agency calls it smart growth, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has hundreds of pages of research on how it can be done in every single country. From designing neighborhoods that are walkable to revitalizing historical buildings for efficiency, countless ways exist to balancing the interests. Our opponents say we can only have one or the other. The amount of research that has gone into smart growth says otherwise. Second, sustained economic growth is vital to pursuing any of our national and global interests, including environmental protection. There's a reason why every so often our political leaders engage in a standoff over the budget, and presidential approval ratings tend to vary with the state of the economy. Economy matters to political efficacy. Without sustained economic growth, our society will not tackle any number of issues, not human rights, not institutional effectiveness, and certainly not economic growth. Nor will we be able to conquer any of our international interests in this regard. U.S. economic sanctions make a difference because of U.S. global dominance on economy. In regard to environmental protection, the United States was able to secure a Paris Global Climate Agreement because of the respect of its impact on the world economy. If we value environmental protection as greater on a global scale, we get the worst of all worlds. Now, when looking at the affirmative argumentation, our opponents start with two observations. First, that these are mutually exclusive values. That's not something that we need to buy in today's debate, because they aren't mutually exclusive. We've given you examples of how we can reach compromise. And if you look at conflicts in the past in the United States and around the world, compromises have been reached between things that aren't supposed to work together. Federalism and anti-federalism makes our democracy what it is. It's how we compromise that leads to solutions, not how we pick A or only B. Second, our opponents say that we have to show that our economic growth is the only thing that we're going to seek in today's debate as the negative, because they're inherently at odds. However, that doesn't make sense, and it isn't consistent with the presentation that was just given to us, in which we are shown shirts and socks and hats that would make money. These things aren't at odds with each other. We're allowed to make money off of green technology, and we're also allowed to not make money off of other types of technology. The fact is that these two things go hand in hand. It's a balance of interest that matters, and saying that they are inherently at odds with each other and you can't have both just because they're in conflict at times is simply untrue. Now, looking at the first contention, our opponents talk about factory farming and how Tyson is one company among many that is killing several chicken and causing air pollution as well. However, they don't address how these regulations would allow the corporations to reach their fundamental interest of making money. We argue that it's possible, that we can make regulations that are smart for Tyson to be able to make money and also not harm the environment as much. Do both hand in hand. In the situation of the affirmative, we only do one. We shut down Tyson altogether, and it means that we can't afford food. We don't have food security in the United States as a result of them only picking option A rather than picking the compromise. On the second contention, our opponents once again talk about the environmental harms of energy production. However, they don't respond to the idea of how we can fuel our world if we downcast every single type of energy that we have. The truth is that we need to rely on the energy that we have now and build for the future. We can't just do one or the other. We need both. With that, I urge a negative ballot. I believe you get the first question in Crossfire.
I'll take it.
Go for it. Okay, we both have a mic now. Cool.
Yeah, I'll just All right, so just because you add the prefix eco to tourism, why does that make it sustainable, especially for larger developed countries like the United States, which have much higher pollution rates than Costa Rica?
I don't think this is a debate about like the semantics of eco and tourism, but it's about exactly what Costa Rica did in revitalizing their economy and allowing tourism and making that their nation's industrial focus rather than agriculture, and allowing for the sustainable environmental protections over time. So it's not about adding eco as a prefix to tourism, but it's more about exactly the policies that took place in Costa Rica. I'd like to address the mutually exclusive values that you offer and how these two are mutually exclusive. Would you agree that there are ways in which you pursue both?
Yes, we argue that the resolution specifically proposes that when these ideas are in conflict, which one should be preferred over the other. And we state how economic growth is usually not only prioritized over environmental protection, but how it actually ruins the environment more.
Okay, but that's an argument of what is happening in the world, but how do you address the fact that what should be happening or what should be valued ought to be both?
Once again, the resolution does not necessarily ask us that question, but rather it specifically states that in times when economic conflict has been harmful to the environment, what action should be taken in this case. We argue that we need to put stricter regulations on the environment, such as factory farms, mining, drilling, etc., in order to further curb the CO2 emissions, the carbon emissions, methane emissions, etc.
Okay, I have another question. How would you respond to the corporate interests in that? So how do corporations make any money if we're just going to slam them with environmental regulations?
Once again, that's the debate. We argue that these environmental protections uniquely lead to better forms, more productive forms of actual growth, right? Once where we don't have to rely on like these non-renewable resources such as oil and coal, etc., that are once again not only harmful to the environment but also have a very limited supply. If we start putting in regulations, start forcing like cleaner alternatives, for instance, this would obviously be better for the United States holistically.
Would you say, or would you agree with this, that if we could frame it in a way that corporations would see how they are making money off of green technology, that they would be more likely to buy into our policy proposals?
I'm not sure exactly like...
I guess in simple terms, what's a corporation's biggest interest?
Profit.
And so if we can frame our environmental policy as a form of profit making for the company, isn't that more likely to lead to success?
No, once again, we argue that there is no sustainable form of profitization, I guess, right? Like anytime that companies specifically start prioritizing profit over actual environmental protection, they're never gonna take environmental protection seriously. We need these regulations.
Does this work? Okay, just making sure. All right, 5 minutes on the clock, starting now. Now, TCU gave you a lot of interesting points about the way the world works now. The resolution tells us and presupposedly tells us that in our world, at least in the world of the affirmative, we argue that environmental protection should be coming first. They're defending exactly what's happening right now, is that companies only care about the economic motive in which they can have an economic growth, or a producing in which their company does infinitely better. But the world doesn't do better in that instance. And that is our defense in which we are arguing in this debate as a whole. And they make the argument in this essence about that we need to come towards a compromise. And that's not what the resolution in itself asks us. Jose did a very good job at telling you about this instance as to how environmental policy has always been out the back door of this question. Is that nations around the world are just now waking up to the fact that the world is polluted with trash, that species around the world are dying at alarming rates, and that people are actually being affected by it. It's that coastal regions, specifically those in poor communities, specifically those in poverty, are going to be the ones hit first. And that's always been about protecting the instance of environmental policy about these people. It's that these people are your working class, your blue-collar jobs people, the ones who make minimum wage, the ones who don't get the economic protections that those at Fortune 500 companies do have. Is that these people are hit first. And that is the question of environmental policy. Without these people, you won't get these Fortune 500 companies. You won't get the very luxurious lifestyles that a lot of rich people have in our society. Is that environmental policy is about protecting these people. So they give you this question about smart policy and exactly of instituting how the economy itself matters for things such as human rights, institutional protections, and of how we come to various agreements because of our economy. No. And the question of the economy itself should be coming last. If the world doesn't exist, then you don't get an economy. If people are dying at alarming rates, if species are dying at alarming rates, then you do not get human rights. You don't get institutions that protect you. You don't come to agreements. Because if people are dying at alarming rates and if policymaking fails at addressing these issues, then there's no way that we can have an economy that is sustainable for us all. If the top 1% of the world owns over 80% of the economy, then how is anybody benefiting from the instance of an economic growth if our environmental policy, in essence, that should be protecting those people that do not get access to that economy is failing? And it's failing at a rapid rate because we have put economic growth first. And that's where I really look at this debate for the negative, and I think it boils down to that very fact. Is that economic growth doesn't help us if we continually backdoor the question of whether or not we should be protecting poor people and endangered species that are critical to our biosphere that allows us to live today. And that should be the fundamental question for the negative. I think that the affirmative does various amounts of a good job that we also should be answering in this debate, is that I've already answered this question about the resolution is whether we should be valuing environmental protection more or should we be evaluating economic growth more. And I think in the question of environmental policy should come first because the people it impacts most, and that economic growth does nothing to help people who are in poverty, as well as those who are sustainably in areas where economic growth was supposed to help them. But you can see many parts around the world, especially major cities in which people in poverty exist and are there, do not get helped in the advent of economic policy that was supposed to somehow sustain the economy to a point that protects them. And this has been a fundamental flaw for economists because they, in this instance, undermine the very faction for what environmental policy should be in question. It's that environmental policy itself has always been bankrupted because it's been the protecting of poor people. It's because poor people are the ones who will be hit first if we completely fail at environmental policy. And in terms of the question of the practices of factory farming, about how we lose money in this question, I say that in a world in which we have no longer land that is usable, in which houses themselves are completely wiped away because of the instance of water erosion, then yes, it will affect companies because they did not take the fundamental stance that when in conflict, they should be protecting these places. That environmental protection should have come first and not the fact that you just wanted to make a freaking dollar. right? This should have been the question of environmental policy in of itself, and that these factory farms kill hundreds of millions of animals and don't care about the poor people that it affects.
In 2018, the United States experienced a crisis the likes of which it hadn't seen before. The state of California banned plastic straws. Now, while hundreds of thousands of people were in duress, companies soon started to realize that they could be environmentally friendly whilst also making a profit. Thus, dozens of companies began selling metal, silicone, and even cardboard straws. Now, these companies are not altruistic. Frankly, they do not care about the environment. What they care about, however, is making a dollar. And when you put the environment and economic growth hand in hand, we see progress. However, when you value one over the other, particularly one in which you need economic growth in order to fix, we see nothing in the United States of America, and thus, my team and I are proud to stand in negations of today's resolution. First, I have one contention to expand upon what Azan brought to you at the beginning of today's debate. That is, that prioritizing solely environmental policy harms the economy. First, the middle class. Essentially, the affirmative came up here and stated that the current middle and class and poor people in the United States of America are being harmed because of how bad our environment is. But think for a moment of what kinds of environmental policies are going to be passed if we target the problem brought up by the affirmative. Taxes. Taxes which affect the poor and middle class. If we are placing undue burdens on the people who quite literally do not have enough money to feed their families and heat their homes in the status quo, we're not going to have a sustainable environment because people will be dying and starving on the streets. Thus, when we look at the middle class and the status quo, according to BBC in December of 2018, they state that the poorest members of society are always the most affected by environmental policies because taxes will always disproportionately affect and harm them. Gas taxes, carbon taxes, emissions taxes. The poor don't have enough money to pay or to avoid to pay these kinds of taxes, but the rich do. Thus, the middle class that the affirmative wants to defend suffers if we go with their plan. Next, however, we have to look at how important it is to actually be able to sell policy to both sides of the aisle. The only way to solve the problems of the affirmative is through legislation and policy and convincing both Republicans and Democrats to pass a bill. In the status quo, we can see, however, how both sides are not willing to negotiate when we value environmental protection over economic growth. The Green New Deal is a perfect example. In early 2019, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez proposed the Green New Deal, which essentially means that we are going to overhaul all the environmental policies that we have had or haven't had in the past several decades in the United States of America. However, Republicans refuse to even talk about the Green New Deal because over the next 10 years, it will cost every single American $72,000 in taxes. This is not sellable policy, and that has been the trend in the United States for too long. However, by doing what the negation has proposed, by joining the two, economic growth and environmental protection, we can actually pass policy that works. Policy that helps the environment and helps American people stay afloat, feed their families, heat their homes, and continue working towards the American dream. Now, looking towards some of what was just stated by the affirmative, essentially a lot of the refutation that was just made was try or die. Essentially, they came up here and painted a doomsday scenario for you. They said that your homes will be destroyed, you will be on the street dying, there will be no trees, there will be no species, and there will be nothing to eat. However, the only response we have to this is that every plan which would tackle the issues that they brought up would cause the same issues. It would annihilate and completely wipe out the middle and class and poorest people in the United States of America. So if you really want to help the people that the affirmative wants to help in the status quo, you need to pass policy that does both. Helps them on an economic level and on an environmental level. Specifically, however, they stated that economic growth does not equal protecting the poor and endangered species. Let's go back to AOC's Green New Deal. $72,000 in new taxes most certainly is unaffordable to most people. It's not affordable to us as college students who are tens of thousands of dollars in debt. This is not a plan that will ever pass in the United States of America, and thus it shows that poor people are only effective if we pass outrageous environmental policy that, one, we don't know will work, but two, is completely unaffordable in the status quo. Again, much of the refutation that they made was this end of world scenario, and some of the refutation that is on made towards their factory farming and energy production points are basically that corporations won't do this. Again, I'll repeat that corporations are not altruistic. They have a profit motive, and they do not care about the environment. In the presentation, we saw companies like Ralph Lauren and Zara being mentioned. Unfortunately, Ralph Lauren does not care about the environment. He cares about profit. And thus, we have to do things that both benefit companies and the environment in the status quo. For all these reasons, we urge a ballot in favor of the negative today. I totally forgot. I'm sorry, I do partly.
Are you good?
Yeah, you got the first question. Go for it.
All right. So in our presentation, we saw products like Nike, Ralph Lauren. Do poor people get access to those sorts of products?
Okay, certainly poor people can't afford things like Nike and Ralph Lauren, right? But if we're focusing on making things like the socks and hats that we saw that are...
Do you think poor people can afford those sorts of products?
If you would let me answer that question, I'll get to that. First, we saw socks and hats being passed around that are exponentially more expensive than what you will find in Walmart. So even if we do start making more environmentally friendly products, poor people are still going to go to Walmart and buy the ones that are bad for the environment. So no, they don't have access to things like Nike, but they choose the cheapest option in order to sustain themselves. Oh, let me ask you a question, certainly. So essentially you stated that poor people are detrimentally affected in the status quo because we're not focusing on environmental policy. How are they going to be affected if we tackle the issues that you bring up in the affirmative speech?
I mean, let me make this very clear, that environmental policy never has come from the direction of what is sustainable about hurting poor people. It's always come from the position of, why does Jeff Bezos have $100 billion of dead money that he doesn't put into like helping environmental policy, right? These are the fundamental questions of, why is the economy doing so great but not protecting the planet that it needs in order to get those profits in the first place?
Okay, question. What is the motive of companies? What motivates them?
I would say making money.
Just a follow-up on that. So if we pass the policies that the affirmative wants to pass, are companies going to be making money?
I think that shouldn't be the first question about whether or not companies should be making money.
Okay,
right?
Let's be realistic and not live in a delusional realm in which we think that everyone cares about the environment. Companies like Amazon and Nike do not care about the environment. So could you answer the question I asked, please?
Right, but that's the problem. We should be caring about the environment.
Can you change a company's mentality?
We should be changing companies.
Should. Everything you say is should.
Yeah.
What is happening in the status quo? What isn't something that's like a delusion and a dream that might happen in 10 years? What is happening right now?
Right. People should be dreaming about a world in which the environment is cared for. The problem is that we have put this fundamental question about making a dollar or making some part of a land about tilling land, but we haven't made the fundamental question of, coming first, what do we do to protect the planet? Right? It's because we've always come from the position of what's best about exploiting the environment so that way hundreds of millions of people can have homes. But we didn't make the fundamental question of, well, we have to cut down lots of these trees, destroy lots of this land, and produce tons of pollution into the air, and we didn't make that question in the first place. A lot of scholars got that wrong, and I think that should be the fundamental change. It should be about should, not about reality is.
Okay, is everybody ready? Everybody's ready?
Woo.
Okay. So, starting now. Okay, so for a second, think about natural forests, grasslands, coral reefs, aquifers, mineral deposits. Now think about eroding farmlands, depleted fisheries, anthropogenic greenhouse gases, acid rain, Under this resolution, that first option, under our side, that first option, that's what you're seeing. Under the second, under the latter option, under that latter picture, that's what you're seeing on the negative side today. On this resolution, we have to pick one side or the other. And as they haven't really answered in their speech today, this is a value debate. Therefore, we're looking at not necessarily policy, but necessarily how environmental protection will be better for this world as a whole. Not necessarily what the policies should be. Again, we should be looking at what we should do, what we should value. And if we look at the status quo today, what we should value is protecting the earth. Because what we see is when we use natural sources consistently, which diminish relative to demand, we see our prosperity start to be threatened. Because you see as we waste more, the productivity of our natural resources decreases, such as like soil and water, as we see with like soil degradation, such as due to like acid rain, we see that we don't get that same crop yield or quality, which therefore hurts that economy that those crops are not growing in. Again, therefore hurting those poor people because they're not getting that food, hurting people across the board because they're not getting that that item that we're producing is hurting that supply of economic input and making our economic output worse, that quality worse, because we are subjecting our environment to harsh environmental things. Secondly, again, going back to that resolution, they haven't really answered that resolution. Again, we need to be putting significance on one or the other side. The negative side is kind of just putting that focus on combining them. However, this is, unlike what they try to say in their speech, this is a doomsday situation because we are seeing these effects currently in the status quo. Some of these effects are irreversible to this day. We're seeing that we have a finite amount of time to fix these issues before they all become irreversible, and then we start seeing real damage within our population across the globe, not just within the United States. That's something we have to take into consideration as well. So trying to combine them would be a waste of time, as again, this has a time frame that is pretty short. So we need to put in priority our environmental protections, because again, that would help us, what's the word I'm trying to look for? Improve the quality of life overall that we see currently, that we don't see currently in the status quo. Thank you. Oh, affirmative.
Hello? Okay. Can you hear me? Is this on? Okay, last speech of the day. Thanks all for being here. Let's get into it and maybe chill it out and add some humor in here somewhere. So, a lot has been talked about today. The AF brings you this awesome world. I think we can all agree in this room that environmental protection should be a priority. Now, what the AF has come in here today is framed this debate as if we are the enemy, saying that necessarily at the very fundamental of this debate, we must be prioritizing economic growth above environmental protection, and that is not within the realm of what the negative has to do in this round. Rather, what we have told you, essentially, the AF has left out the word significant in this resolution today. We have told you that neither one must be more significant than the other, but rather that both are incredibly significant if we want to achieve the tangible success to the issues that the affirmative is talking about. I didn't have a chance to crossfire, but if I had, I would have asked them, how do we achieve or fix any of the things they brought up without economic growth, without the corporations who put us in this mess in the first place? Both are necessary elements, and we cannot pit them against each other. We have been doing that in our policy and in our mindsets forever, and that is why we are in this mess. This mindset must change. We have to understand that the two are not mutually exclusive, as they said at the top of this round. In thinking that, that is how we have ended up in the very drastic situation we have come to. So essentially, the affirmative commits the nirvana fallacy today, wherein they offer you this utopian world where everything is better and all of the problems which surely suck and are horrible, the chicken genocide and the aquifers. Essentially, the nirvana fallacy is such that they have offered you this better world without really looking at the costs and effects and benefits of what happens when we take away things of the status quo. The better world is not on itself and on its merit necessarily better. We have to understand how all of these things operate together. We have to understand that the economy, which they defined short-sightedly as simply increasing GDP, we have to understand that the economy and economic growth is a living, breathing thing. And at the very heart of the economy, here's my economist side speaking to you all, is us, the consumers. These things that they're selling us, the plastic straws and all the things we want to get rid of, that starts with us. This economic growth perpetuates our society, and we will not achieve any necessary good environmental protection without it first coming from the economic growth. So essentially they come up here and give you that definition of economic growth as simply GDP, but we have to understand that at its very heart, we are the economy. The economy drives on demand, which is us. So if we want to see positive change, it comes from us. Essentially, they villainize all these corporations. I, too, can go on many capitalist rants. Trust me, I have in debate a lot. But essentially, we have to understand that we have the will and the motivation and the right to sway these companies to do other things, and we can. They have pitted them against each other in a way that we will never see the environmental protectionism that they so want. And I think all of us in this room want that, even the negative. But we must understand, and we cannot be naive to think that that type of environmental protection is going to happen without the help of our economy, this materialistic society in which they live. So they also go on to talk a lot about essentially economic inequality, which is a little bit non-topical, but essentially they talk about a lot about the poor people. I think Veronica did an excellent job of getting up here and explaining to you how the very ways in which we fix this without economic growth, i.e. via legislation, is only going to further burden and exacerbate the very problems that they bring up here to you today. And as a result, we have to understand, as Azan said in his first speech, that this is not an A or a B situation, but rather there is always an option C. In the past, we haven't looked for that option C because it took us this long. It took the polar bears dying and all of those crazy and sad photos you saw in the presentation today to finally realize that this crap is happening in our world. But we have to understand that the very products that we live in and use all the time, like the laptop that the Affirmative is using today, straw I have, everything in this room, from the table, the chairs, and everything, this microphone I'm talking to you on right now, came from the economy, came from producers, came from those capitalist bastards that we really like to villainize in these debates, right? And those are the very people who are going to also produce those environmentally friendly things that we want going forward. That change starts there. These two things coexist and must coexist for us to fix these issues in the status quo. And so as a result, essentially at the end of the day, we argue today that the two are not mutually exclusive and cannot be. To consider them mutually exclusive at the top of the round is essentially to say the F wins anyway. But like I said, they're committing a nirvana fallacy here. We have to understand that the only way to have any tangible, good change is through combining the two and by stopping in legislation and mindset, pitting them against one another.
Join me in thanking all of our debaters.